Okay, so my name is Vidhu. I'm a final year student from the Bangalore University Department at Jnana campus. And what I'm intending to do is to actually solve all of the previous case set problems that I could find. So I will be starting with the 2013 paper and then proceed on to the 2018 paper, which is the last one that was there for the last examination. So I will just go on with it and I'll start. I think 10 participants are there right now. So I think they will come gradually. I will post a recording of this on YouTube so you can watch it later. Okay, so the first question, I think I posted this on the page, on the form too. This is a matrix, and you have to find out whether it's Hermitian, unitary, Hermitian and unitary, and neither Hermitian nor unitary. So what you need to know is there are two conditions that you have, right? When you're looking at Hermitian matrices, you're basically saying, if it's a Hermitian matrix, you say A is equal to A dagger. What does your A dagger mean? Your A dagger means it's a complex conjugate, right? You're looking at complex conjugate. What about unitary? Usually it's denoted as U, right? A unitary matrix is denoted as U. U dagger is equal to I. Okay. So now I will go on to the solution. This is pretty simple. So all you have to check is, this is your matrix A, okay? And you have to check if A is equal to A dagger, and you have to check if A dagger is equal to I. Okay, so I'll move on to the next slide. So you have a matrix A. You look at the condition for Hermitian. Your A is equal to A dagger, so your first row is first column. You'll have to put a minus sign here because you need to take the complex conjugate transpose, right? So first you take the transpose and then you take the conjugate of that. So then first row is first column, second row is your second column, and then your minus signs change. So what you see is your A is equal to A dagger here. Okay, so what's the condition for unitary? Your condition for unitary is you have A is equal to A dagger is equal to I. So when you multiply these two matrices, you end up getting 1, 0, 0, 1. So your first row, your first column should give you a 1. First row and second column should give you a 0, and so on and so forth. Okay, this is pretty simple. Let's move on to the next one. So this has a little bit of trick to do with it. Okay, so what you do when you're asked to find the eigenvalues is you end up diagonalizing the whole matrix. Okay, so which is a very, very stupid way to do it. There are a couple of tricks that you can use to do this. Okay, so one important key point that you need to remember is that the product of the eigenvalues is equal to the determinant of the matrix. Okay, so let's look at this. You want to find out what the product of the eigenvalues are. Okay, so what you do is you find out the determinant of the matrix. So this is something that you can remember. There is a bigger derivation about this, how the product of the eigenvalues gives you the determinant of the matrix. So what you can do is you can find the determinant. This is a pretty simple determinant to solve. So there's some other method that you can probably use to calculate the determinant in case of really huge when you have a large number of 3x3 matrices, and I'd like to discuss that now, although it's not relevant to the problem. This is pretty simple to solve, right? You just have to take alpha, beta, and gamma, and you can just take alpha into beta into gamma minus, you get a 0 when you take this and you expand it along this row. So what I'd like to talk about is a method called the Sars's method. Okay, so basically what you do here is you have to write this column, these two columns here again. Okay, so you write alpha 0, 0, 1, beta 0. Okay, so you take this and you multiply this. Okay, so you get an alpha, beta, gamma. You take this and you multiply this, you get plus 0. Take this and you multiply this, you get a 0. Okay, plus 0. Subtract it from this. So this is, when you multiply all of this, you get a 0. When you multiply all of this, what do you get? 0, 1, alpha, you get a 0. Again, you get a 0. So this is a very nice way to solve the determinant. It's called the Sars's method. Okay, So now let's move on. So you know that is alpha, beta, and gamma. Okay. Next, this is something that you have to really by heart, these differential equations that you have. And I'm sure if you've done your master's, you would have probably learned about Legendre differential equations, Bessel differential equations, Hermite differential equations, and so on. So is this a Legendre differential equation or a Bessel equation or Hermite equation? And I don't think you might have heard about the Beltrami equation. Let's just look at how it looks like. Okay. So your Legendre differential equation looks like this. Okay, 1 minus x squared y double prime minus 2 y prime plus n into n plus 1 into y is equal to 0. Okay, so this is just a thing to memorize it. You have to memorize this, and you'll have to compare how these equations look with this question that is given to you. Next is your Bessel differential equation. Okay, and then this is your Hermite differential equation. So this is in terms of y. Okay, the question is in terms of, it's basically like this. You have a z double prime minus 2x z prime plus 2 lambda z is equal to 0. Okay, so that's how you have it here. Okay, so if you compare it with this one, what you can see is that you will get this kind of a form. Now the Beltrami equation is a partial differential equation. Okay, so what you will have here is you have a dou w by dou z prime. What is this? This is a complex variable. Okay, z, and you have taking the complex conjugate, a relationship between the complex conjugate and the complex variable. Okay, so next let us go on to the Fourier transform of a square pulse. Okay, so we are asked whether it is a cosine function, a sine function, a sinc function, and a tan function. So I like this function a lot, the sinc function. It's used a lot in sampling and signal processing. Okay, so Fourier transforms are used a lot in signal processing. So when we kind of solve the problem, I will elaborate on that. So what you need to do is, this question has a little bit of an ambiguity because they haven't really specified everything. So what you need to do is you need to know how to write a square pulse mathematically. Okay, the mathematical form of a square pulse needs to be known. So when you have a square pulse like this, okay, so you have a minus a to a, say this is some constant value c. Okay, so the criteria that they missed out here is that it should be a symmetric square pulse. Okay, so it should be a symmetric square pulse. Okay, so now what we can do here is, okay, so how do you write that? So when it is between minus and a, you have a constant c. Okay, and otherwise, other than that region, you have 0. Now if you look at this, you have a g of k is equal to 1 divided by root of 2 pi integral from negative infinity to infinity f of x e to the power of plus ik dx. You need to remember this. Okay, this is something that you need to remember. This is the formula that's used for your calculating your Fourier transform of a particular function. And here, what do? You feed in this function here. Okay, so you substitute c. And since in the region other than your minus a to a, it's 0, so you can change the limits of the integral to minus a to a. So you have a g of k is equal to 1 divided by root of 2 pi integral from minus a to a c e to the power of plus ikx dx. Okay. After that, you all know how to integrate an exponential function. It is pretty easy to do, right? So you can pull out your c because it's a constant. What do you get here? You get a c divided by root of 2 pi, and then you get an e to the power of plus iks divided by ik minus a to a. You substitute the limits of the integral, and then you multiply and divide by 2a. And why do I do that? I want to get it in the form of a particular form. Okay, I multiply and divide by 2a, and then I end up getting this. So what is your sine theta? It's equal to e to the power of I theta minus e to the power of minus I theta divided by 2i, right? So what do? You take that and you write it in this form. So here the only thing is, yeah, theta is equal to Ka. Okay. So now this kind of a function is called a sinc function. Okay, sine of Ka by Ka is called a sinc function. And this is only produced when you have a symmetric square pulse. Okay, the word symmetric was pretty important in the question. It has to be a symmetric square pulse. So how does it look like? Basically, you have something like this, okay, and narrows down there. Okay, so it's supposed to be a little more better. My drawing is not very good. So it's supposed to be a little more symmetric on both sides. So that's how it looks like. Okay, it's not like your sine function, which looks like, you know, up and down like that. It's not like that. This is a little more different. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Okay, so your Fourier series expansion of x squared. Now, let me ask you this, okay? Just think about it. When I say, is x squared an even function? What do you immediately answer? You basically say x squared, yes, obviously it's an even function, right? But you need to explore into the possibility of where this x squared lies, okay? What is the interval of this x squared? So I cannot say that x squared is even unless the interval is given to me, okay? So when you say x squared, oh yes, it's an even function. No, it's not an even function. The immediate question that I should ask if somebody asks me, is x squared is an even function, is I should ask for the interval. So I'll show you why it is that way. Okay. So say I have this function defined from 0 to 5. Okay. So let's say it's 0 to 5. Okay. And now if I repeat it, what do I end up getting? Let's say this is from 5 to 10. Okay. So I end up getting my function to be this way. Okay. Right. So if that is the case, then what's going to happen here? Okay. It's always going to be this way. This is not an even, not an odd function. It's neither. Okay. It's not an even, not an odd function. The only way I'll get an even function is if I have something symmetric. Okay. So if I've got a -5 and a 5, then I have something like this. And if you repeat that in that same interval, say this is probably going to be 15, then I can say that my x squared is even in the interval between -5 and 5. Okay. So let's move on. Okay. So I have to find out the value of this. Okay. Summation of n is equal to 1 to infinity 1 divided by n squared using the Fourier series expansion of x squared. Okay. So I'll have to look at what the calculations are. So since I know my x squared in the interval from -5 to 5 is an even function, I can eliminate b sub n equal to 0. I'm sure you've all learned Fourier series in your BSc, and I'm sure that there are no BSc students here. So what is your function? How can you write your f of x? So f of x is equal to a naught divided by 2. Summation of n is equal to 1. N is equal to 1 to infinity a sub n cos of n pi x by l plus summation of n is equal to 1 to infinity b sub n sine of n pi x by l. So x square is even in the interval. So this is very important, which many people neglect about. Okay, and therefore your b sub n is 0. Why? Because your b sub n term is basically something like this. You've got a sine function here, which is odd, right? So this term goes off to 0. Okay, now here you can use this and you can calculate these integrals. Okay, so 1 divided by L, integral from -L to L, f of x cos of n pi x by L dx, which is equal to 1 divided by 5, integral from -5 to 5, x squared cos of n pi x divided by 5 into dx. So after you substitute the limits. Now this, I should probably give you a link if you're interested. There's a popular method which is called the Hindu method or the tabular method. Okay, what you usually do is you use your ILATE method. So your A stands for what? Your algebraic T stands for your trigonometric function. You arrange it in that order. And then you use the Bernoulli's. That's what I do usually. Bernoulli's integration formula. Okay. And then you can calculate this out. So this is your Hindu method, or your tabular method is another method that's pretty interesting. I can share the link with you. I've got another video that I like about this. Okay, so this can be done using any of these two methods or any other methods that you can find. Now here, what do you end up doing? What were you asked for? You were asked for summation of n is equal to 1 to infinity. You were asked for 1 divided by n squared. Okay, so this Fourier series is not, you will have to manipulate this and take out the 1 by n squared from this Fourier series of x squared in the interval -5 to 5. Right, so your f of 5 is what? So you need to substitute your f of 5. Why is that? Because your limit was from -5 to 5, right? So you substitute this as f of 5, and what is that? X squared, right? So you substitute 5 squared, because your function, what are you basically doing? You're taking your function f of x and you're writing it in terms of functions of sines and cosines. That's basically what you're doing in your Fourier series, right? You're writing your function, take any function and write it in terms of sines and cosines. So you basically end up getting an x square, which is your 5 square over here. Now you have a 25. So what do you do here? A naught by 2, you've already calculated A naught here. So 1 by L, 1 by L, integral from minus L to L, f of x dx is your A naught. So when you calculate that, you end up getting a 50 by 30. So you put that up here, okay, A naught by 2. So that's why you got from 50 to 25. You substitute this value here, okay. Whatever calculation that you got from this integral, you substitute it here. And then you end up calculating this elaborately. And what do you see here? You've got an n square. So what you can write is, you can pull out your summation of 1 to infinity, and you can write 1 by n square, and then take all the other terms to this side, and you will get a pi square by 6. Why does this term go away? Because it's a cos squared. So even if you have, if this was -1 whole power 2, right? If you have a cos of n pi, you write it as -1 whole power n, right? So if you write cos square, what do you get? -1 whole power 2n. It's going to be even. So whatever you do, you get a +1. So I think we've done a lot of problems based on this in the BSc course. Now let's move on. Okay, so this is pretty simple. Everyone would know this. These are the properties of Legendre polynomials. The first property of the orthogonality relation for the Legendre polynomial is given by integral from -1 to +1 p sub n of x, p sub m of x dx is equal to 0 for, is it m equal to n? Is it m not equal to n? Is it m equal to n equal to 0? Or is it m equal to n equal to 1? So obviously, you know, when you say 0, you're saying you can only get it. This is one of the properties. So when you have m not equal to n, is the only time you'll end up getting a 0. If your m is equal to n, you will end up getting a 1. That's a property of your Legendre polynomial. You would have done this in the first semester if you're an MSc student from BU. Okay, so you've got an integral from -1 to +1. This is your property of your Legendre polynomial. Now, for the Poisson distribution, the standard deviation sigma is related to the mean. Okay, as how? Sigma is equal to root of m, sigma squared is equal to root of m, sigma plus m is equal to 0, and sigma is equal to m. So what kind of a distribution is your Poisson distribution? Your Poisson distribution is a discrete probability distribution, right? So now it's a special case of your binomial distribution, which is also a discrete probability distribution. Now, what is the difference between your Poisson distribution and, let's say, something like the Gaussian or your normal distribution, which is your bell curve, right? Your Gaussian distribution is your bell curve. So what is that difference is that one of them is continuous and the other one is a discrete. So if you look at your Poisson distribution, it's discrete. But in the case of your Gaussian or normal or bell curve, it's a continuous probability distribution. And I kind of really like this comparison. When I was doing a couple of experiments in nuclear physics, I realized that if you apply a beta source, what kind of a distribution that ends up giving is a Poisson distribution. And when you look at a gamma source, it ends up giving a normal or your Gaussian distribution. And why is that? Okay, so the specific thing to remember here is that in the Poisson distribution, the counts are of rare events. So when your beta source was giving out these, so when your beta source was, giving out these emissions, it was of very less strength compared to your gamma source. Okay, so your gamma source ended up giving a lot of emissions. So that's why you end up getting a normal distribution or your Gaussian distribution. Whereas in the case of your beta source, you end up getting a Poisson distribution. Okay. So here the counts are rare events, all the events are independent. And the average ratio does not change over the period of interest that you're considering. Period of interest as in your experimental time or whatever. So unlike the normal and binomial distribution, here the only parameter that we need to look at is the average rate. What is that parameter? The average rate. That's the only parameter that you have to look at, unlike your normal, which is the Gaussian, and the binomial distributions. So here you only have to look at n bar, okay, the mean of the distribution, which can also be written as lambda sometimes. So this can be written as e power lambda power x divided by n factorial. This is the distribution. Now, when you do the derivation, you'll end up getting this. So the intention over here is to not actually just do the problems and be done with it. Okay, the intention over here is to actually dissect and really understand what each option means or what each term means in this problem. That's how I'm going to be going about things, to actually understand what is happening. Okay, rather than just saying, okay, fine, this is the answer and just move on like that. Okay, so this is a standard deviation of your Poisson distribution. So sigma is equal to root of m. Now, this is pretty simple if you just have to put up your logic. So they're telling you that this is your probability distribution function. Okay, so the value of k for which the function f of x is equal to e to the power of minus x, 0 less than or equal to x less than or equal to infinity is a probability distribution function. Okay, and what is the value of k? These are the options that are given to you. So when you're told it's a probability distribution function, what is the key point that comes to your head? The probability distribution function over all space is going to be giving you, when you integrate it, it's going to be giving you 1. So basically the thing that you have to remember here is integral from minus infinity to infinity or all space, f of x dx is equal to 1. That's what's going to be given to you, right? So so integral from 0 to infinity f of x dx is equal to 1. So you substitute this and you calculate it. Okay, why 0 to infinity? Because the interval here is from 0 to infinity. So you substitute this. What is your integral of an exponential e to the power of minus kx divided by minus k from 0 to infinity is equal to 1. So you have e to the power of minus infinity minus of e to the power of 0 after you substitute the limits. Okay, so this is a typo. This shouldn't have been here. Okay, after you substitute the limits, you really don't need it, right? So what do you get here? E to the power of minus infinity, which is 1 by infinity, which is 0, right? You get a minus 1 divided by minus k. So you end up getting a k is equal to 1. Okay, so what was the answer? K is equal to 1. Now, this is pretty simple. You will probably even say it if I wake you up, you're asleep or whatever. So let's just look at this. Okay, so two bodies of masses m collide with each other in a stationary reference frame, right? So they just said collide. Okay, it doesn't move apart. They've just said collide. So what is the reduced mass of the system? So that is m 1 m2 divided by m1 plus m2, which is very simple. So you just have to substitute m into m divided by m plus m, which is equal to m by 2. M squared divided by 2m, which is m by 2. Okay, so let's look at the options. What do you have here? You have an m by 2. Okay, so this is the reduced mass formula and it's been worked. So now cyclic coordinate does not explicitly appear in the Lagrangian only, the Hamiltonian only, both the Lagrangian as well as the Hamiltonian. Okay, both the Lagrangian as well as the Hamiltonian, conjugate momentum, okay. So what do you mean by a cyclic coordinate? Cyclic coordinate is an ignorable coordinate. Okay, cyclic coordinate is also called an ignorable coordinate. Ignorable coordinate. Okay, so let's move to the next slide. Now, if your expression for your Lagrangian does not involve a coordinate explicitly, then such a coordinate is called your cyclic coordinate or ignorable coordinate. So what happens because you have this cyclic coordinate is the generalized momentum which corresponds to the cyclic coordinate is a constant of the motion. Okay. Now, if you're looking at your Hamiltonian, so you know that your Lagrangian, the cyclic coordinate does not explicitly appear in your Lagrangian. Okay, sorry, just go back to this one. Okay, so your cyclic coordinate does not explicitly appear in the Lagrangian, you know that. Now, what about the Hamiltonian? Okay, so using this point that you have, the generalized momentum corresponding to the coordinate is constant of the motion. Okay, so what do you have basically? You should have remembered this if you're in the if you've done your first semester, you should probably know about this. So dou h by dou q is equal to minus p dot. Okay. So what is your generalized momentum corresponding to a cyclic coordinate? They've said that you p. So I'm going to be working this backwards and telling you that I got the constant of motion. So dou h by dou q dot, I'm telling you that there is no coordinate. So if that is a 0, then your p dot is equal to 0, which means your generalized momentum corresponding to your cyclic coordinate is a constant of the motion. So basically you're going back to that. So you can work this out back ways too. Okay, so if I say p is a constant in motion, your p dot is 0, so I can just supply 0 here. That means this coordinate that I have is not going to be there in the Hamiltonian. So in both the cases, your Lagrangian as well as your Hamiltonian, your cyclic coordinate does not explicitly appear. Okay. So let's move on to the next question. The equation of motion for a bead sliding in a uniformly rotating wire in a force-free space is. Now, what do you mean by force-free space? When you say force-free space, what you see is that your V is equal to 0. That means your potential is equal to 0. Okay. Now, let's say you have a uniformly rotating wire with a bead. So this is how the system looks. Okay. It's uniformly rotating. So my omega is going to be constant. Okay, it's rotating uniformly. So what do I have here? I've got my options. Okay, I have to select which one of these there are. So the bead sliding in a uniformly rotating wire in a free space, a straight wire rotates about the fixed axis perpendicular to the wire. That's what I showed you just before. I'll just draw it again. You have a fixed axis, a straight wire, and this bead is going around. This is your omega, angular velocity omega. Okay, so you've got an x square is equal to r cos theta and y is equal to r sin theta. Okay, and you've got a theta is equal to omega t, right? That's how you write it. Theta is equal to omega t. Theta dot is omega, which is your constant, which is already given to you in the question. How do you know that? They say it rotates with constant velocity, right? So your t is equal to what? Half m v squared. How do you write that if I have two components? I'm using polar coordinates to solve this. So it's that so that it's easier. Okay, using polar coordinates. So your v can be expressed in terms of x and y as x dot squared plus y dot squared. I really don't need to do this. I'm just trying to like try to do it step by step so that you can understand everything. Okay, so you have an x is equal to r cos theta and y is equal to r sin theta. So what do you have here? You have an x dot squared plus y dot squared. So you substitute these two values here. How do you do that? You have to calculate y dot, which is equal to r dot sin theta. You differentiate the first function into the second function. This is something that people usually forget about. They, make a lot of mistakes while trying to do this two variable differentiation. So you've got an r squared sine theta and r sine theta. You have to differentiate that. So you have a cos theta, and then you need to put your theta dot. Usually people tend to forget this. Okay, so that's how you get this y dot. Now you need to take your x square, and this is what you get. So t is equal to half m r dot square. After you simplify this, square it and simplify it, you get an r dot square plus r square theta dot square. Okay, then you get your t is equal to, what is your theta dot? Theta dot is omega. It is a constant. So what are the only variables that you have here? You have an r terms that are variables, right? So now when you're looking at a force-free space, basically your V naught is equal to 0. So what is your Lagrangian? Lagrangian is the kinetic energy minus the potential energy. So what do you end up getting is the kinetic energy. So you have d by dt of dou L by dou R dot minus dou L by dou R. What is this equation called? It's called the Euler-Lagrange equation. Okay, it's called the Euler-Lagrange equation. What do? You substitute this value that you have got here. So you got an m r dot minus m r omega squared. Okay, you substitute this and you get this. Then you equate it on both sides, you cancel out the mass terms and you get the equation of motion. Okay, so this is a little tricky question that they've given. They've said the general displacement of a rigid body with one point fixed is a rotation about some axis is the statement of Bertrand's theorem, Euler's theorem, Virial theorem, and Chasles theorem. So they've said the rigid body is fixed at about one axis. So the general displacement of the rigid body with one point fixed is a rotation. Okay, so this point is fixed. That was you said, so it's a rotation. So now I'll go on to read the statements of these theorems. Okay. So Bertrand's theorem basically deals with the conditions for closed orbits. So now if you look at the central force potentials with bound orbits, okay, there are only two types of central forces, scalar potentials, that can give you closed orbits. So what we're talking about is, one is bound orbits, okay, and then we're talking about closed orbits. So there are only two systems or two types of central force potentials that can give you closed orbits. Okay, one is your gravitational or electrostatic potential, which is of this form, and the other one is your radial or harmonic oscillator potential, which is of this form. So I'm sure you're familiar with these forms. The only thing is that you can get closed orbits. Okay, so Bertrand's theorem basically gives you the condition for closed orbits. The next theorem that they've said is the Euler's theorem, or the Euler's rotation theorem. So it's that in a three-dimensional space, any displacement of a rigid body such that a point on the rigid body remains fixed. Okay, a point on the rigid body remains fixed is equivalent to a single rotation about some axis that runs through the fixed point. Okay, so what was the situation we were describing? We were describing the situation where you had your body and it was fixed, and it's only, you're talking about the general displacement of that body. So it looks similar to this, right? The Euler's rotation theorem seems to describe this situation here. Okay, so the next theorem is your Virial theorem. Basically, kinetic energy is the potential energy. That's what the Virial theorem states. So the total kinetic energy of a stable system of discrete particles bound by potential forces with that of the total potential energy of the system. Okay, so your kinetic energy, how do you know that this is the potential energy? Basically, your F dot R is your work done, right? So that's a negative of your potential energy difference. So you end up getting your kinetic energy and the potential energy here. Okay, so we'll move on to the last one. So there is this confusion between this and this, okay, because these two describe very similar situations. So it states the most general rigid body displacement can be produced, I'll just trace that, can be produced by a translation along a line called the screw axis or the Mosey axis, followed or preceded by a rotation about an axis parallel to that line. So here, basically, you're not fixing that point, right? You're not getting that point fixed. The body can move up and down, okay? Or it can rotate, okay? So the question said what? The question said, the general displacement of a rigid body with one point fixed is a rotation about some axis is a statement of your Euler's theorem, okay? Because your Chasles theorem involves translational motion too, okay? Not just your rotational motion. So let's move on to the next question. If a particle moves under a central force field located at r is equal to 0, describing a spiral, r is equal to e to the power minus theta, then the force is proportional to r square, r cube, r4, r power 4. So all this is wrong, okay? They've given the wrong options. They should have given inverse of these options, preferably. Okay, so here the orbital equation, you need to remember the orbital equation. This is how the orbital equation is given to you. M divided by L squared U squared F of 1 by U is equal to minus U minus D squared U divided by D theta squared. So what is given to you? Given to you is your R squared is equal to e to the power minus I theta. What is your U? U is the inverse of your R. So if U is equal to 1 by R is equal to e to the power of theta. What do you do now? You do du by d theta, which is equal to e to the power of theta, d squared u by d theta squared. I should have written, I kind of messed up a little bit of coding here. So this is e to the power of theta. And now you substitute it into your orbital equation. And then you simplify it, okay? It's pretty simple to simplify it. What do you get here? After this, you have to convert your 1 by r, which you had substituted initially, back to your r form, okay? So after you substitute that, how do you get your 1 by r, which is your e power theta? So all these terms come to the bottom. So you get an r cube here. So ref of r is proportional to 1 by r power 3. If you notice that none of the options match, it's supposed to be a 1 by r power 3. Okay. So let's move forward. Now, two photons. This is a question from relativistic mechanics. So two photons x and y are moving in the direction opposite to each with a velocity c relative to an observer in the inertial frame. The velocity of the photon x relative to the photon y is. So now if you're looking at Newtonian mechanics, and if I consider these particles to be consider this to be a Newtonian problem, I can say that, okay, fine, what do I say my relative velocity is? So I'll just write this as relative velocity is equal to the velocity of x. They've said velocity of the photon x with relative to y, so minus velocity of y. What I end up getting is, because they're moving in the opposite directions, I get a c minus of minus c, which is a 2c. And this is like completely bogus, right? Like you can't have any particle greater than your speed of light. So let's look at all the options and let's go on to do it relativistically. So you use Einstein's velocity addition theorem. Your u of x, y is equal to u naught x minus u naught y divided by 1 minus u. Your O stands for your observer, okay? So u o x, u o y divided by c square. What do you do? One of the photons are in opposite directions, right? They're moving in the opposite directions. So you have a c minus of minus c divided by 1 minus c into minus c divided by c square. So this is your answer. You're getting c, not 2c, but c. Okay, so this is question number 15. The Lagrangian for a 3-particle system is given by, so it's given in really fancy terms with your eta and all. I feel that it is better to consider your eta 1 as x, eta 1 to be x, eta 2 to be y, and eta 3 to be z. Okay, so here your alpha is real. Then one of the normal coordinates has a frequency omega. Okay, so the Lagrangian of a three-particle system is given by L is equal to 1 divided by 2 eta 1 dot 1 squared plus eta 2 dot squared plus eta 3 dot squared minus alpha squared eta 1 dot squared plus eta 2 squared minus eta 3 squared minus eta 1 eta 2. So when you're usually writing your Lagrangian, you write it in terms of this form, right? So you write it as half mv squared minus half kx squared. We're looking at oscillating systems, right? So what do you do now? You're supposed to have a half here, okay? And you're supposed to multiply each of these with a 2, okay? And then you go on to simplify this way, okay? So one of the normal coordinates has a frequency omega as, what do you do? Just a minute, let me just take a spotlight. Is it omega square is equal to alpha square? Omega square equal to 2 alpha. What is the omega squared value of this? So let's proceed. This is a small oscillations problem. Okay. So you've got your L, you've multiplied it with 1 by 2, like I showed you before, and you've split up that eta 1, 2 and eta 2, 1. So basically what you're getting here is something like you got an x dot, you got a y dot, you got a z dot, okay? Then here what do you have? You have an xx, you got a yy, you got a zz, you got an xy, and you got a yx, sorry, okay? So here, let's construct the kinetic energy matrix. So for the kinetic energy matrix, you just have 1 throughout, okay? Why? Because you got an xx. So this is basically your ix dot x dot. This is your iy dot y dot. This is your iz dot z dot. Okay, so you basically have just 1, 2, 3. And why do you not include the half? Because you basically have a half m x dot squared, right? So your mass here is unit mass. Usually you have mass terms here coming up here. Okay, so now let's look at the potential energy matrix. Okay, so you look at the potential energy matrix, you basically have an Ixx, Ixy, and Ixz, and so on. Okay, similarly here you have an Ixy, and Iyy, and Iyz, and you've got an Izx, Izy, and an Izz. Okay, so you can substitute that here, right? So if you have a coefficient 2, you get a 2 alpha squared. I've taken all the alphas common because all of them are common to all of these terms in the matrix. And similarly, you get a -1 term here because this was an xy term, right? Okay. And then similarly, you can fill up all the other numbers in the matrix. So what do you look at? You look at the characteristic equation. What do you get? Your determinant of A minus lambda B is equal to 0. Your determinant is, you substitute the values of the matrix, and then you proceed forth with the calculation. So you have to find out the determinant of this part, the matrix. And once you simplify the determinant and equate it to 0, okay, you end up getting 3 eigenvalues. Okay. After you simplify the determinant and equate it to 0, you end up getting your lambda is equal to, in this case, you get a alpha squared. Okay. In this case, what do you get? You get a -2. In this case, you get a -2 alpha squared. And in this case, your lambda is equal to 3 alpha squared. Okay. So that's the 3 eigenvalues. You have your alpha squared, -2 alpha squared, and you've got a 3 alpha. So the eigenvalues correspond to the square of the frequencies omega square. Therefore, we obtain the normal frequency of small oscillations as alpha squared and 3 alpha squared. Why aren't we including this? It is non-physical, okay? So it is non-physical, and you throw out this negative solution basically. So your negative solutions imply that you don't have a small oscillation possible, and it gives you divergent solutions, okay? So now there's a small exercise that you can do. You can check your stability of the potential. Okay, how can you do that? You can differentiate your V naught. Your V naught is basically this. Okay. You can differentiate a potential and set it equal to 0. Then you can check your equilibrium condition. Okay. So you can check the stability of your potential. This is pretty simple. An electron at rest is made to move with a velocity root of 3 by 2 c. Its mass then becomes what? Okay, just a second. So its mass then becomes what? You got a 2m naught, you got a 3m naught, you got an m naught divided by 2, you got a root of 3 divided by 2. Okay, so you got m is equal to m naught divided by root of 1 minus v square by c square. You all know this formula. What was given to you? Given to you is the velocity v is equal to root of 3 divided by 2 into c. So you substitute that here. What do you end up getting after you simplify? You get a 2m naught. This is a PU level question. So the electric field intensity of the surface of a charged conductor is 0, directed normal to the surface, directed tangentially to the surface, directed along 45 degrees to the surface. So looking at the electric field intensity on the surface of your charged conductor, you know that inside it's going to be 0. So on the surface of your charged conductor, let's just move on. Let's look at the properties of a conductor in your electrostatic field. The field inside your conductor is 0. Outside the conductor, the electric field lines are perpendicular to the surface. Okay, it starts with the charges and ends with the charges. Now, any excess charge that resides entirely on the surface, or surfaces of your conductor. So there's nothing inside. Okay, nothing in the other surface. Next question. The existence of a quadrupole moment for a charge distribution signifies that it is spherically symmetric, having only positive charges, spherically asymmetric, having only negative charges. So what do you mean by having a quadrupole moment? So if your quadrupole moment is 0, your distribution is spherical. Okay. If your quadrupole moment is non-zero, you have an asymmetry. So the nuclear quadrupole moment is a parameter which describes the effective shape of the ellipsoid of your nuclear charge distribution. A non-zero quadrupole moment indicates that the charge distribution is not spherically symmetric. So Q is taken to be positive if your ellipsoid is prolate and negative if it is oblate. Okay, so these are the standard properties of your Q. Next question. This is pretty simple. What does your del dot phi imply? Okay, it implies that the magnetic field is solenoidal, magnetic field is non-solenoidal, no current is flowing, magnetic field is not flowing due to any. So magnetic field is not due to a current flow. So what does your del dot B imply? It implies that your divergence is 0. When your divergence is 0, what do you mean? It implies that it's a solenoidal. Okay, your magnetic field is solenoidal. So I'll just talk about the rotational vector fields too. What do you mean by an irrotational vector field? Where your curl is equal to 0 everywhere. So the vector field is irrotational. Now your solenoidal vector field can also be called as your incompressible vector field, where your divergence is equal to 0 everywhere. Okay. Okay, so this is the last question that we have for today. Because of electromagnetic potentials, the number of Maxwell equation is, okay, reduced to 2, increased to 6, 4, and reduced to 1. Okay, what are your electromagnetic potentials? Your electromagnetic potentials are A and B, right? Your magnetic vector potential and your electric scalar potential. Okay, so first, what do we know about this magnetic? What do we know about your electric scalar potential? Okay, so you can write this into your E in terms of your electric scalar potential. You can write your B in terms of magnetic vector potential. So what is the benefit of doing this? Okay, we'll come to that in a while. So this is a basic procedure. This is a big derivation that you have to do, but I'm just telling you how to do it. Okay, so you put your E in your Faraday's law. What are the 4 different types of laws that are incorporated into your Maxwell equations. First, you have a Gauss law, then you have a Gauss law for magnetism, then you have your Ampere's law, then you have your Faraday's law, and then you have your Ampere's law, which is modified to your Ampere circuit law, right? So now you need to find your E, and you put this into the Gauss law. Okay, then this is the equation that you get. Okay, so this replaces a Poisson equation, to which it reduces to in the static case. Okay, so when you don't have this kind of a charge, what do you end up getting? When you're looking at a static case, your del squared V is equal to 0, right? Next, let's substitute your E and B into your Ampere circuit law modification and use this vector identity, and you end up getting this equation. Okay, so what have you done here? You've basically taken the Maxwell equations and reduced it to these two equations, and you've taken and reduced it to these two equations, right? You've taken your Maxwell equations and you've reduced it to these two equations. So what components that you need? What was the information that you needed to do your Maxwell equation? You needed your E vector, which involved Ex, Ey, and Ez. You needed a B vector, which involved Bx, By, and Bz. Okay. Now, what is the benefit of introducing these potentials? Your potential, your electric scalar potential, and your magnetic vector potential. What is the benefit of that? Sorry, this is supposed to be A. You have one scalar component, an Ax, Ay, and Az. So you're basically reducing the number of requirements here when you're introducing these potentials. So what happened now? Now what you've done is you've reduced your four Maxwell equations into these two equations. Okay, so 1 and 2. So if we go back, what do you get? So because of the electromagnetic potentials, by introducing them, what happened? Your Maxwell equations is reduced to two equations. Okay, your Maxwell equations is reduced to two equations.